What's up, U.S. history? Welcome to the lecture on the New England colonies, 1620 to 1750. The first question we're going to explore is, where were the New England colonies? And I'm going to grab my pen here real quick. You'll notice that we've got North America, the southern colonies, and then starting around here, Massachusetts, modern-day states of Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. Right? So, to get a better look, we see the modern-day state of Massachusetts. We see the initial settlement at Plymouth, Boston. We're talking about Kittery, Maine, Newport, Rhode Island. This is the area we're talking about. Colonial New England. So what were the colonies of New England? Okay, a few things you should know. First of all, unlike the South, unlike Virginia, where there were large plantations separated by miles and miles and miles, these were small, compact villages of farming communities, okay, with a village green, a meeting house, public schools. Nobody had to pay for school in New England, in colonial New England, and or I should rather say they all paid for school. It was a public good. But they were clustered close together, just like a common New England village, okay, which is very different from the Virginia colonies. There were a lot more families than in the Virginia colonies. People came with full families rather than just men coming to strike it rich. The Puritan families came here to settle, and they brought their families with them. Again, as it shows here, the average age of marriage for women was 22, and for men it was 27. This average represents the fact that sometimes they were married more than once depending on mortality, but generally they didn't marry super young, as is popular perception. An average of about 6 children per family, and this was really one of the first times in English society that grandparents were actually part of the family. Up until here, grandparents, people didn't live long enough for there to be grandparents within the extended family. So stable families equals stable communities. Okay, stable, orderly communities. Order was also kept by patriarchy, so there was definitely an authoritarian male father figure. The men really ruled the roost. If you were a woman, you really didn't have any rights necessarily. You couldn't own property. You couldn't testify in court. It was a pretty male-dominated society. Let's see. There was a low mortality rate. So, people in New England lived on average about 10 to 15 years longer than they did in England. Okay, and they lived about 30 years longer than the average person in the Virginia colonies. So it was a good, generally in terms of life, in terms of mortality, it was a good place to be. The next question is, who founded these colonies and why? Okay, historians like to split these variables up into push and pull. Okay, so there's certain elements that pulled people to the American colonies, and there's certain variables that pushed these people to come. In terms of the pull, the things that drew people to the American colonies was, number one, religious freedom and economic opportunity. These are two of the biggies. Religious freedom, to some degree political freedom. But what this meant was, just because they were coming here to be free to practice their own religion does not mean that the religion that they proposed gave everybody else the freedom to practice their religion. That's what this is for. Even some of this freedom included freedom to prosecute or persecute others. Okay, and this was religious freedom for some. Okay, you needed to be of the religion to have the freedom. And we'll talk more about that later. But they also came for economic opportunity, for sure. Some of the push factors. So they were pushed out because of severe religious persecution, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So, but they were also pushed out because of political persecution. In Europe, in England, there were constant battles between the king, the king's parliament, which was similar to our Congress, and the commoners. Okay, constant fights. There was a civil war, there was a revolution, and there was a lot of political turmoil. And some of these people wanted to flee that political turmoil. Number 3 is the enclosure movement. So the enclosure movement was basically when the nobility in Europe, or in England in particular, realized that it was actually just as profitable to have one person with a bunch of sheep than it would be to have 10 farmers. Okay, just as profitable for them. And this occurred as a result of the Black Plague. The Black Plague took away a lot of the laborers, There weren't as many farmers for the nobility to use, and they needed a stable source of income. And they started shepherding. They started raising sheep. But as the population came back to its natural levels, those people had no place to go. Okay, the nobility they were making plenty of money, if not more money, raising sheep, and they didn't need farmers anymore. So this led to the rise of a large, propertyless, very poor white working class in England with nothing to do, and many of these people were the ones that came to the Americas. Okay, there was also at various points economic recession, severe economic recession, which would lead to debt. And back in those days, if you were in debt, you didn't just get a bad credit score. You could be hanged. You could be imprisoned for a long period of time. And that goes to the harsh laws as well. Hopefully, escaping some of those harsh laws, and perhaps to escape imprisonment. Many people were given the choice if they stole something of either going to the Americas and working, or going into an English prison. And it was a pretty clear choice for most of them. Now, by far, one of the variables that we hear the most about when it comes to New England is religious persecution. The Pilgrims were coming to America to flee religious persecution, and that is in fact true to some degree. And to really understand what this means, you really need to understand the English Reformation. Okay, the English Reformation. So what was the English Reformation? In a nutshell, the English Reformation caused the creation, or led to the creation, of the English Church, the Church of England. Okay, and the people that believe in the Church of England are known as Anglicans. Okay, Anglo is the root, a similar root of England. So they're known as Anglicans. And there had already been turmoil, and the Protestant Reformation had already occurred. People had already challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. And now King Henry VIII, pictured here with his 6 wives, he had a problem. He was married to Catherine of Aragon from Spain out of political necessity, and he decided that she wasn't giving him a male heir. And he wanted to have his marriage annulled. Under Catholic law, you can't get a divorce. So he wanted to get it annulled, which meant that the marriage was never real in the first place. The Pope would not let him have an annulment. So what he did was, this is another picture of his 6 wives, a little more modern view. So what he did was, he actually had, he actually said, well, if you're not going to give me an annulment, then I no longer recognize you as the head of the church. And in fact, what he did was he placed himself at the head of the church. And I'm going to skip ahead. So basically, instead of the Pope, King Henry VIII becomes the head of the Anglican Church. Most of the church traditions remain the same. The church is pretty much the same church, the same hierarchy, the same traditions, the same rituals. The only difference, really, was that the King of England is now the head of the church rather than the Pope. Okay? So the first thing he did was he got an annulment, and then he proceeded to marry more and more women trying to get that male heir, and he had many of them executed. And this is a little chart of his 6 marriages and what happened to them and why. Okay, and then a funny cartoon. Oops, I'll go back here. A funny cartoon about one of the worst jobs you could ever have. Henry VIII's 6th wife. And here he's got some marks on his bedpost, implying that she may be number, get rid of that. She may be number 6. So, King Henry VIII, he establishes the Church of England, right? But in Europe, there was another guy named John Calvin who had his own differences in opinion with the Catholic Church. He felt the Catholic Church was much too corrupt, and much too large, and much too institutionalized, much too political, and he had a very powerful impact on people. His theory of predestination said that God had predestined everybody's life. Okay, God had determined already who was going to heaven and who was not. Okay, and if you were among the elect, the people that were going to go to heaven, you would be given signs of God's grace. And if you lived in accordance to God's rules, you would in fact go to heaven. You could be a member of the elect and turn and decide to shun God, and you would go to either purgatory or hell. So the good news is, if you're a member of the elect, you still need to do good works to get into heaven, But if you're not a member of the elect, then there's really nothing you can do. This actually led to a lot of this influenced a lot of people, especially very highly pious people. And there were members of the Anglican Church who felt that King Henry's reforms did not go far enough, right? He basically just kept the institution and the structure of the Catholic Church, which they felt was unholy and corrupt. So you have a group of people known as the Puritans that want to purify the Church of England. Okay, that's the way to remember it. So Puritans want to purify, okay, the Church of England. And they basically, so we've got the Roman Catholic Church leading to Protestants, the establishment of the Church of England, and then there's two splits off the Church of England. So the Puritans wanted to purify the church. They were a little wealthier. They had a little, they weren't as radical. And then the Separatists, who we know as the Pilgrims, were a lot more radical. They believed in a greater equality, and they felt that the English church was so corrupt it needed to be replaced by something else. Okay, so we've got these two offshoots, these people that were influenced by Calvin to protest against the English church. So it's these people that in 1620 they actually leave Holland and they come to America. Now, why did they leave Holland? They left England because they were being religiously persecuted. Okay, but instead of going right to America, they initially tried to settle in Holland, and they actually had religious freedom in Holland. The problem was they felt that their kids were being corrupted by Dutch society. Okay, Holland is the home of Amsterdam, and all those wonderful things that go on in Amsterdam now probably were occurring back then, and they didn't want their holy, pious children to be brought up in such an unholy place. So they left Holland to try to come to America to create a whole new city based on the Bible, based on biblical law. Okay, so in 1620, a group of separatists boarded the ship the Mayflower. They sailed to America, and they landed actually around the Cape Cod area in Plymouth. Okay, they were a minority. Okay, the separatists were a minority of the settlers in Plymouth. They were somewhere between 20 and 50% of the people on the boat. So that's really important to know. This was not all pilgrims coming. And because they were not all pilgrims, they had to strike a deal with the non-pilgrim majority. And that deal they struck was known as the Mayflower Compact. And that was a deal that said, basically, if we can land here, what we want to do is establish a society where all men with property have a vote and have a say in the government. And we'll give you a say. We believe in that. And this is important because what it establishes is, instead of the king ruling by divine right because God picked him, the people that rule, the government here is being chosen by the people. It's a representative government, and it's the roots of our modern day democracy with the Mayflower Compact. It's one root. There were many roots. So that's 1620, and this is a pretty typical image of the Pilgrims landing on Plymouth. And you see a Native American on the left side of your screen. Okay, their first winter was tough. It wasn't as tough as Virginia, but they did lose 50% of their settlers in that very first year. Okay, 50%. Their success was followed up later by the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay, again by the Plymouth Company. So this is a joint stock company trying to make money. They're still trying to make money, but they're a little more settlement driven than they were in the South. So in 1628, not the Pilgrims, not the Separatists anymore. These are the Puritans that are coming to America. And this is a picture of John Winthrop. Okay, he's the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and his goal, his dream, was to make America and the Puritan colony a shining city upon the hill. Okay, he had a big speech about how the eyes of the world will be shined on their colony and how they should be a model for a good Christian society for the rest of the world to follow. It's the earliest signs of a term that will be known as American exceptionalism, that America was destined to happen by an almighty God. So that's 1628. Now, in this area, the Puritans, like I said before, they escaped religious persecution, but that doesn't mean that they gave absolute religious freedom. In fact, there was strict enforcement of religious laws. They were almost as strict, or just as strict, as the society they left. Okay? And the reason why is because they weren't against persecution. They were simply against themselves being persecuted. They felt that the people persecuting them were wrong and they were right. Okay, so we had this is a cartoon that we read in class, and the guy on the boat. So this is the Mayflower. He says, "Is there religious persecution in America?" And the Puritan comes back, "Well, give me 6 months." Okay, that's funny. So, what happened to those who disagreed in Puritan society? Well, they were either punished, sometimes severely, or excommunicated, which meant they were banished from the colony. Okay, we have, in terms of punishment, there were ear snippings, hanging. You could be burned at the stake, pilloried, put in stocks, which I'll show you. I'll show you a couple images. So here's an image of a branding. So if you had stolen something, you'd be branded on your right hand a T for thief, and then on the other hand, and then if you kept stealing, you may have an ear cut off. This is an image of somebody in the stocks, so it's public humiliation, standing there all day or maybe numerous days, being shunned by the community. We've got an image of for gossip. Gossip was a sin, so they would literally put this gag over the heads of people, to keep the gossips in line. This is a ducking stool. This would be at the end of a large pole that they'd be strapped into that stool and lowered into water. It was to mimic or sort of represent drowning. Okay, again in the stocks, but this time he's going to have his ear nailed to the stock to make it a little bit more painful. Hanging was frequent. Okay, it was a very tough society, and if you weren't punished, the even worse being punished perhaps was being banished. Okay, and there's a few people that were banished. Actually, I'll go back here real quick. So Mary Dyer and Anne Hutchinson both believed that anybody could interpret the Bible, even women. And so this challenged two areas of authority in New England. Number one, it challenged the men and the patriarchy of New England, and it challenged the priest and the religious patriarchy of the community. And for that, they were both banished. Mary Dyer actually chose to come back, and she was hanged. Roger Williams believed that government and religion should be separate. He was one of the first ones to advocate for separation of church and state. And it wasn't because he was, and the reason he did that was because he believed that government was having a corrupting influence on religion. And by separating the two, you actually allow for religious freedom and you prevent religion from becoming politicized and therefore corrupted. He also believed in treating Native Americans fairly and paying them an honest wage for the land that was taken. He was quite an individual, one of my personal historical heroes. Roger Williams was banished, and he went and started the colony of Rhode Island. Let's see here. Well, that's funny. Okay, so here's a quick, the last thing is a quick timeline. So again, 1620, Plymouth. Okay, it was tough at first. They lost 50% of their population, but they found relatively open fields, and the Native Americans were much friendlier than in the South. They had a lot of advantages over the Virginia colony, and although a lot of people died and it was very difficult, they grew much faster and had much less difficulty than they did in Virginia. Okay, 1620 Massachusetts Bay is founded by Puritans, not separatists, and it was very fast growing. In 1629, an offshoot, the New Hampshire colony, is established. In 1636, the Pequot War takes place. The English are starting to move and demand more land. The Pequot are resisting. Small skirmishes lead to an all-out war. And the massacre at Mystic were English troops and their Narragansett and Mohegan allies, Indians, so English and Indians, attacked the Pequot Indians and massacred the entire village in 1636. There's a great video on the blog that you can watch about that. 1636 also, Connecticut and Rhode Island are established. In 1642, there's the English Civil War between Puritans and Anglicans, and there's a lot of religious tension. I mean, you need to know that the Puritans and the Anglicans didn't just dislike each other, they disliked each other enough to go to war. Okay, and this war sometimes spilled out into the English colonies. It would lead to conflict within the English colonies. After that, in 1676, King Philip decided to attempt to get rid of the English completely. He created an alliance of Indians and attacked the English colonies with the attempt of wiping the continent of the English. He actually had some really early successes, but with a couple tough winters and a lack of crops, the English were able to defeat him. This was the largest, or this was the most bloodiest war per capita in American history. It was a major event. King Philip, whose name was Metacom, put up a very good fight, and he was eventually captured. His head was chopped off, and his head was actually put on a pike outside of Plymouth for I don't know how many years. In 1688, again, there was conflict in England with the Glorious Revolution, and there's another brief post about that. But those conflicts in England and in Europe have a tendency of making themselves manifest in America as well. And I know I'm going through this is just a real quick overview. Finally, 1692, Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials were essentially, let me go back here. The Salem witch trials were essentially a fight between lower class citizens and upper class citizens. Okay, there was a lot of dissension. There was economic recession. There was some differences between the farmers and the more rural community. There was a lot of tension within that society, and the people who, sort of on the short end of the stick used superstition and religion to get back at these people, and they falsely accused quite a few people. There were many people that were hanged. Giles Corey, he was an elderly man that was pressed to death, which means that his body is put between two boards, and big, huge boulders are stacked upon him until he passes away. Pretty vicious, pretty vile. Things like birthmarks could be interpreted as signs of the devil. They believed in spectral evidence, which meant that you could say in a court of law, well, the ghost of John Stoneyberg or whatever came and spoke to me, and he put a curse on me, and that would be admitted. Okay, spectral evidence of ghost coming and speaking to you could be used as evidence. It was a very superstitious, very violent time, and it really reflects the anxiety and you know, it was a very stressful relationship with you know, right after the King Philip's War, the French are always possibly attacking. There's a lot of anxiety in society. Everyone's looking at each other. Very suspicious society, and the Salem witch trials brought the worst out of our, you know, the earliest English ancestors. Life pretty much continued in that vein. There were some other important events for sure, but we're going to pick up when we start looking at the French and Indian War. And just quickly, why is it important to understand these colonies? Primarily, you know, it's interesting. This is just a funny video about the immigration debate. It's just interesting and important to remember that we're all immigrants to this country, even Native Americans were initially immigrants to this country. And it's just important to remember that. And of course, there's much more. There's many more reasons, which I'll get into later, about why it's important to understand the diversity that existed in the colony and how these colonies emerged. But that's it. Go ahead and take the quiz and see how you do. And we'll see you in class.